They called him Caesar. They called him Augustus. But behind the title, they should have called him something else. Predator, monster, god in human skin. His name was Tiberius, emperor of Rome, lord of an empire, and the ruler of a place so dark that even modern historians still struggle to describe it. While the empire thought he was meditating in retirement, he was actually building a secret world, full of young boys, hidden pools, and unspeakable acts. And the worst part? He didn't hide it. He believed he deserved it. This isn't mythology. This is true. This is real. This is history's most haunting emperor, and the story they tried to erase. Keep watching if you can stomach it. He was born not in darkness, but in quiet ambition, the kind that crept through Rome like a whisper in the night, a name barely spoken but always present. Tiberius Claudius Nero, born in 42 BC to a noble family, son of a mother more powerful than most generals and a father with little legacy left behind. And while others came into the world with fire and fortune, Tiberius came with silence, a shadow following him from birth, a feeling that something was always just out of place, as if the gods themselves had plans but refused to speak them aloud. And so the boy grew, tall, serious, unsmiling, while other children laughed in the gardens of the Palatine Hill, and even as a child he was seen as cold, reserved, as if he never truly belonged among the living. And history would one day ask, was this a curse or was it a warning? Because Rome had seen rulers before, brash, loud, glorious. But Tiberius was different, withdrawn, observant, a boy with eyes that seemed too old for his face. And his mother, Livia Drusilla, saw it too. And she shaped him like iron, molded him like marble, whispering plans that reached beyond one generation, because Livia had married the most powerful man in the empire, Augustus, the first emperor, and suddenly young Tiberius was thrust into the orbit of greatness, not because he wanted it, but because his mother demanded it. And Augustus didn't love Tiberius, didn't even trust him, but used him like a blade, marrying him off to his daughter Julia, a woman known for her laughter, her affairs, her wine-drenched nights, while Tiberius, somber and bitter, found no joy in her arms, no peace in the empire he served. And still he obeyed, because Rome was not a place where happiness mattered. Only duty, only power, only legacy. And so Tiberius became a soldier, and a good one, leading campaigns in Germania, crushing rebellions with brutal precision, earning the grudging respect of his men, even as they whispered about his silence, about how he never celebrated victories, how he never spoke more than needed. And the Senate praised him, Augustus tolerated him, Livia pushed him. But inside, Tiberius began to rot, not with disease, but with resentment, with coldness that started in the bones and spread to the heart. And he begged Augustus to let him retire, to leave Rome, to disappear into exile on the island of Rhodes. And strangely, Augustus allowed it, perhaps hoping the strange, bitter stepson would vanish forever. But Livia had other plans. And while Tiberius sulked on the shores of the Aegean, Livia worked behind palace walls, removing rivals, whispering to allies, weaving her son's name deeper into the future of the empire. And when Augustus's chosen heirs, Gaius and Lucius, mysteriously died young, poisoned, sickened, or simply gone too soon, the path became clear, and Tiberius was recalled to Rome, summoned not with love, but with necessity, because Rome could not be left without an heir. And so in 4 AD, Augustus adopted Tiberius as his son and successor, not with joy, but with resignation. And Tiberius returned, colder than before, more withdrawn, more watchful, and he ruled beside Augustus for a time, learning, watching, waiting, until in 14 AD, the old emperor died quietly in his bed, and Tiberius became emperor, not with trumpets, not with cheers, but with dread, because the Senate feared him, the people did not love him, and he did not want the crown. And yet he wore it, not like a laurel, but like chains, and Rome braced itself, not knowing what kind of ruler he would become, only sensing that something dark had settled over the city, because power does not always reveal a man's nature. It reveals his hunger, and Tiberius was already starving, not for gold, not for glory, but for something twisted, something hidden. And as he walked the marble halls of the palace, wearing the purple robes of Caesar, the statues seemed to watch him, as if Rome itself knew that its emperor was no longer just a man, but something colder, something empty, something dangerous. And though the city still lit its lamps at night, The light did not reach the emperor's soul, because Tiberius had already begun to slip, slowly, quietly into the shadow that would one day consume everything he touched. Tiberius wore the crown like a curse, not with pride but with quiet dread. And while other emperors paraded through the streets in golden chariots, he stepped onto the throne with silence in his eyes and iron in his spine. And from the very first day of his rule, Rome could feel it, that something cold had entered the palace, something that didn't smile, didn't celebrate, didn't seek glory but only control. And while the Senate expected grand gestures, proclamations, reforms, what they got instead was a man who said little, who listened much, and who trusted almost no one. Because Tiberius didn't want to rule for glory, he ruled because there was no other choice. Because the weight of his mother's ambition had dragged him into power he never truly desired. And yet, once he had it, he kept it with claws sharp and deep, refusing to play the games of Roman politics, refusing to charm the crowds, refusing to become the kind of emperor that Rome could adore. And at first this made him seem noble, disciplined, even humble. He rejected titles, downplayed rituals, denied divine honors. But behind that humility was something else, something darker. A man who didn't need to be worshipped to feel power. A man who watched every senator with suspicion, every general with distrust. A man whose face remained unreadable even as others trembled before him. And slowly, methodically, Tiberius began to reshape the empire. Not with speeches or battles, but with fear, quiet fear, the kind that crept into conversations and lingered in doorways. And while he gave power to his trusted ally Sejanus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, that trust was poison waiting to boil. Because Sejanus was not loyal to Rome, only to himself. And together the emperor and his soldier ally ruled like twin shadows, whispering death into ears and sending scrolls of execution across the empire. And men who once laughed freely began to watch their words, their guests, their windows, because Tiberius did not raise his voice. He raised his eyebrow, and heads rolled. And while Rome still held games and feasts, the laughter always came with a glance over the shoulder, because no one ever knew who would disappear next, and Tiberius didn't care for love. He cared for obedience. And in his marble halls he moved like a ghost, silent and calculating. And then came the turning point, the death of his son Drusus, poisoned, perhaps by Sejanus, perhaps not, but it shattered something inside the emperor, something barely held together, and the loss twisted his grief into suspicion, and suspicion into madness. And the blood began to flow faster, trials without evidence, accusations whispered in the dark, and Tiberius, once cold but stable, began to drift, and then he left. He abandoned Rome entirely, retreating to the island of Capri in 26 AD, leaving Sejanus to rule in his name, and there, hidden in the cliffs and shadows, the emperor became something else entirely, something the historians would struggle to explain for centuries. Because on Capri, the mask came off, the public duties vanished, and what remained was a man unbound, a man rotting in luxury and paranoia, and rumors began to seep back into Rome like rot. Stories of cruelty, of obsession, of perversions too dark to speak aloud. Stories of children brought to the island not to be taught but to be used. Of boys forced to swim naked with the emperor, trained like animals, called his minnows. And while the people whispered, the Senate said nothing, because Tiberius still ruled, still sent orders, still signed death warrants with a flick of his wrist, and the empire, vast and proud, bowed to an emperor who no longer stood in its city, no longer cared for its people, but sat instead in a villa overlooking the sea, lost in his own desires, his own nightmares. And Rome continued, like a theater where the audience knows the play has gone mad, but keeps clapping anyway. Because to stop would mean facing the truth, that their emperor was no longer a leader, but a shadow, a sickness at the heart of the state. And still no one dared challenge him, because even far from Rome, even surrounded by his own decay, Tiberius was still power. And power once unleashed does not fade. It infects. And the island of Capri, once a place of beauty, became a symbol of rot, of secrets, of screams behind closed doors. And Tiberius, cloaked in silk and silence, smiled at nothing, spoke to no one, and watched the sun set each day as if waiting for the world to end, not with fire, but with the quiet collapse of everything good, everything human, everything Roman. Capri was beautiful, and that made it worse. Its cliffs rose like marble knives from the sea, Its waters shimmered like melted glass, and from the outside, it looked like paradise, a retreat for poets, lovers, and emperors alike. But once Tiberius arrived, everything changed, because beauty in his hands became a mask, and behind the villas and gardens lay something far more disturbing, a kingdom built not on law, but on secrecy, a court of whispers, fear, and obsession. And the man who ruled it no longer pretended to be the emperor the world remembered, no longer wore the robes of restraint, no longer hid his darkness behind the duties of state, because Capri was the place where the emperor uncoiled, slowly, completely, and in the privacy of his palace he created a world without consequences, a world where cruelty was amusement, where shame was erased by command, and where those who served him did so with broken smiles and silent terror. And it began, as always, with power, absolute power, the kind that bends not just men, but morals. And with every passing month, Tiberius became something less and more than human, a creature whose needs were no longer ruled by reason, but by impulse, by something darker, something twisted, and the villa was filled with music, laughter, wine. But it was the wrong kind of laughter, the kind that chokes in the throat, the kind that comes when you're too afraid not to smile. And the guests were not senators or scholars anymore, but performers, strangers, and young boys, chosen not for their minds, but their faces, their bodies, their ability to obey. And it was said that children were brought to him as gifts, that governors and generals hoping for favor sent their own household boys to Capri, hoping to please the emperor. And Tiberius, they said, trained these children not in letters or law, but in silence, in service, in shame. And the name the slaves gave them, minnows, was not poetic, it was precise, because Tiberius used them like toys, like creatures meant for his pleasure, teaching them to dive between his legs in the bath, to nibble at him like fish, to treat their emperor not as a ruler, but as a god of appetite. In the stories, once only rumors, spread like oilfire, impossible to contain. And while the Senate still wrote their reports and Rome still burned incense in his name, everyone knew the truth, that the emperor had become a ghost, a monster, a man who sat on a mountain while children wept behind marble doors. And worse still, he didn't stop at play, because Tiberius's cruelty was layered, sharp, methodical, and those who displeased him were not simply punished, they were destroyed, humiliated, torn apart, and thrown from the cliffs, their bodies smashing on the rocks below like broken toys. And he watched it all with the cold fascination of a man who no longer saw people as people, only as tools, amusements, threats, or offerings. And every day Capri grew quieter, darker, more cursed, because who could speak in a place where silence meant survival, where the emperor's smile could mean death? And some tried to leave, to escape the island's grasp. But Tiberius had ears everywhere, and his agents were ruthless, loyal only to him, men who had tasted his power and now craved more. And among them was Sejanus, still in Rome, still acting as his proxy, still growing stronger while the emperor decayed. And some said it was Sejanus who fed his madness, who sent him reports designed to deepen his paranoia, to isolate him further, so that one day Sejanus could rule in his place, not as an advisor, but as emperor. And for a while it worked, because Tiberius, drowning in lust, fear, and grief, gave him more power, more authority, until Sejanus was issuing death warrants in the emperor's name, sentencing senators, replacing magistrates, and reshaping Rome in his own image. And it might have worked, if not for ambition, because Sejanus made the fatal mistake of reaching too far, of seeking to marry into the imperial family, to place his own blood on the throne. And in that moment, something inside Tiberius snapped back into focus, as if the fog of Capri lifted just enough for him to see betrayal. And when he did, he struck without warning, without mercy, recalling Sejanus to Rome under false pretense, arresting him in the middle of a Senate meeting, and within hours the man who had nearly ruled Rome was dragged to prison, strangled, and dumped in the Tiber, his name erased, his allies executed, his family humiliated. And Tiberius, far away on his island, watched it all unfold like a play written just for him. And yet this did not restore balance, because by now the emperor had tasted too much cruelty, worn too many masks, and the madness would not retreat, only grow quieter, colder, more ritualized, and his days continued with wine and blood and the laughter of children who no longer laughed. and his nights were filled with nightmares that he mistook for visions. And still Rome waited, prayed, hoped he might die, might vanish, might give them back their city. But Tiberius held on year after year, ruling from the shadows, unseen but never absent. And Capri became less an island and more a graveyard, not just of bodies but of innocence, of conscience, of Rome's own soul. And the emperor, this man of stone and shadow, sat on his marble throne, smiling at the sea, while behind him, the empire he once held together with silence now began to splinter. And still, no one dared speak his name too loudly, because on Capri, even the wind seemed to listen, and no one knew which rumor might reach the emperor's ears and become your last breath. And so the people stayed quiet, the children obeyed, and Tiberius, the emperor of ruin, drifted further into legend, monstrous, untouchable, and alive. Tiberius had become the most feared man in the world, but in truth he was also the most trapped, because the farther he distanced himself from Rome, the more Rome began to turn into something he could no longer control. And though he still held the title of emperor, he had created a system that ran without him, a machine of fear and silence and second-hand orders carried out by men who used his name like a sword. And so the emperor who once marched through the city in triumph was now a ghost who ruled from shadows, sending letters from Capri that made senators tremble and generals sweat. But no one had seen his face in years, and even his voice, once firm and cold, now came only in rumors, echoed in threats and punishments passed down by faceless agents who answered only to him. And in this prison of his own making, Tiberius paced, growing older, more bitter, and more paranoid, unable to return to Rome, yet unwilling to let go, because he feared what waited for him if he stepped back into the light, a city that no longer trusted him, a senate that whispered behind closed doors, a people who had learned to smile while sharpening their knives. And so Capri became more than a home. It became his fortress, his laboratory, his mirror, a place where he could be worshipped by the terrified and obeyed without question. And yet even there, peace never came, because peace requires trust. And Tiberius trusted no one, not even the walls around him, and certainly not the men who served him, because too many had plotted in silence. Too many had written their names in the sand, hoping he would one day fall, and he knew it. He felt it, and he struck before they could, ordering executions for reasons so vague that even the accused didn't understand why they were being dragged away. And the more power he held, the more afraid he became. Not of armies, but of secrets, of laughter behind curtains, of the quiet kind of rebellion that grows in locked rooms. And the truth was that Tiberius hadn't ruled an empire for years. He ruled a theater of fear, where each man played a part and prayed he wouldn't be chosen for the final act. And behind the stone walls of his villa, the emperor kept records not of policy or law, but of betrayals, of rumors, of faces that looked too confident or voices that sounded too clever. And it was said he had entire books filled with lists, men who once questioned his choices, women who refused to flatter him, governors who paused too long before saying, "Yes, Caesar," and every name on those lists would one day disappear, quietly, without trial, without explanation, because Tiberius had found his solution to disloyalty: silence it before it spreads. And so a quiet war was fought across the empire, not with soldiers, but with spies, not on battlefields, but in dinner parties in temples and homes where families whispered under candlelight and wondered if they would live through the week. And in the heart of it all sat the emperor, watching, reading, remembering, and yet never truly seeing, because the isolation had begun to change him, not just his mind, but his body, his habits, his soul. And the man who once dined with philosophers now ate alone in silence, who once led armies now feared the sound of footsteps behind him, who once gave speeches now sent servants to read his words in his place, and the villa that once echoed with music now echoed with orders and prayers, in the soft scuff of sandals retreating in fear. And Capri itself began to feel cursed, as if the island itself had learned to hold its breath, waiting for the next command, the next execution, the next game the emperor would play when boredom crept in. Because boredom was his true enemy now, the thing that made his mind wander to cruel places, to suspicions and fantasies. And it was in those moments that Tiberius grew dangerous, because without anything left to conquer, he turned inward, picking apart his memories, doubting every friendship he had ever had, questioning even the loyalty of the stars that moved above his garden. And he took comfort only in rituals, his morning walks, his carefully arranged meals, his scrolls of philosophy that he now interpreted only through the lens of power, reading Stoicism as a defense of punishment, reading Epicureanism as permission for pleasure, and in that twisted lens he found a new version of himself, not the soldier he once was, not the emperor he once pretended to be, but something colder, something more patient, and more dangerous, because now he didn't need to shout or fight or even leave the room. He could destroy with a whisper, with a nod, with a pen dipped in ink. And so he ruled not with fire but with frost. And those who wanted to reach him had to pass through a maze of intermediaries. Men who lied to protect themselves, who exaggerated threats and invented conspiracies just to keep his attention. And every lie they told became real. Because when Tiberius believed something, it became truth. And that truth destroyed lives, ruined cities, and turned Rome into a place where honesty was a death sentence. And the senators who once dreamed of glory now dreamed only of survival, of retiring quietly, of never being noticed. And even as the emperor's body aged and his strength faded, his shadow grew longer, heavier, because fear doesn't need muscles. It doesn't need armies. It only needs memory. And every Roman remembered what happened to those who crossed him. And so even in his absence, he remained present, a name spoken only when the doors were closed, a face imagined behind every curtain. And the emperor, for all his wealth and worship, found no peace in it, because the more he erased his enemies, the more he imagined new ones. And Capri became a mirror that showed him not Rome's weakness, but his own. And as he stared into it, day after day, he wondered, not aloud but in the silence of his own thoughts, whether any of this had brought him joy, whether the power he had held so tightly had ever made him feel whole, or if the crown had simply been another chain, and the robe another disguise. And though he would never admit it, not to himself, not to anyone, there was something hollow in his gaze now, something that even the servants noticed when they found him staring out to sea, as if waiting for something that would never return. Not a fleet, not a friend, but a version of himself that had been lost long ago in the blood, in the lies, and the endless, choking silence. Capri had become a floating kingdom far from Rome, not just in distance but in reality, because while the Roman Empire lived and breathed under senators and legions and citizens with olive oil in their kitchens and prayers to their gods, Tiberius wandered through halls carved into cliffs, surrounded by marble statues that no longer looked like gods but resembled the strange thoughts in his head, the memories that refused to leave, the shadows of things he couldn't forget. And in this place where the sun struck white stone and the sea never stopped whispering, the emperor retreated further from the world, deeper into himself, until even his most loyal servants didn't know what version of Tiberius they would meet each day, because some days he was silent and still, watching the waves for hours as if they would rise up and swallow him. In other days he was sharp, alive with suspicion and cruelty, giving orders with a soft voice and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And in the center of his villa, now more shrine than residence, he built what many would later call the Emperor's Garden, a place filled not with flowers but with indulgence, built not for beauty but for control. And those who were invited to see it rarely spoke again, either out of fear or because they simply vanished. But the rumors of what went on there were louder than any soldier's trumpet and darker than any battlefield, because it was said that Tiberius had filled this garden with boys, not grown men, but young children taken from noble families or stolen from ports and poor households, dressed in robes and trained to play the role of his entertainers, his companions, his swimmers. And when the emperor grew bored of politics or the sun or even his own reflection, he would walk barefoot into this garden, where fountains spilled wine and fruit hung from silver branches, and he would laugh with them, touch them, have them bite his skin like animals, because he believed their innocence made him clean again, as if each moment of shame was washed away in their laughter and obedience. And this was not a single moment of madness. It was ritual, repeated and refined. And those who served him were expected to maintain it, to arrange the bodies, to supply the music, to say nothing and see nothing. And those who objected disappeared from the island forever, their names scratched from the ledgers, their faces forgotten even by their own families. And while Rome believed the emperor was ruling from afar, what he was truly doing was unraveling in plain sight. And this unraveling took shape not only in lust and secrecy, but in obsession with the past, because Tiberius could not let go of the people he had loved or the ones he had lost. And the name Germanicus haunted him like a curse whispered by the wind, because the man had been a golden star. Everything Tiberius wasn't, beloved by soldiers, adored by the people, noble in a way that Tiberius found both enviable and threatening. And when Germanicus died under suspicious circumstances, many whispered that it had been Tiberius himself who arranged it, and even if he hadn't, the guilt stuck to him like ash. And so the emperor began seeing Germanicus's face in dreams, in statues, even in strangers who visited the island and in the garden. He had a boy dressed to resemble him, painted and trained to speak in a voice that mimicked the dead man's tone. And he would speak to this boy at night, alone, sitting beneath olive trees while the stars burned overhead, asking him questions that made no sense, repeating old arguments, and sometimes just weeping, though no one was allowed to say the emperor had cried, because weakness was the one thing Tiberius hated above all else. Except perhaps Rome itself, which had never loved him, never welcomed him the way it had welcomed others. And so now he rewrote it in his mind, reshaping the Senate into fools, the generals into cowards, and the people into insects whose loyalty could be bought or broken, but never earned. And this bitterness bled into everything. Even the letters he sent to Rome, which were once careful and official, now strange and poetic, filled with half-threats and quotes from philosophers he no longer believed in. And when governors failed, he didn't replace them with better men. He replaced them with crueler ones, men who ruled with knives instead of scrolls, who enforced taxes not with orders but with chains. Because Tiberius didn't want the empire to work, he wanted it to match the rot he felt inside. And slowly, without anyone noticing, Rome began to bend to his shape, not because he commanded it, but because no one dared to disobey. And as this empire of silence grew, Tiberius's isolation deepened, and the garden of obsessions expanded, because lust has no ceiling and loneliness has no bottom. And the emperor, who once marched at the front of legions, now spent his days creating games in the garden that no historian dared record in full, because they were not games of politics or sport, but of domination and submission, of beauty turned into obedience, of pleasure twisted into punishment, and those who saw them never smiled the same again. And at night, when the torches burned low and the moon hung heavy over the island, the emperor would pace, speaking to himself, not in madness, but in memory, reliving every slight, every betrayal, every failure, his marriages, his children, his exile, his mother's shadow, his stepfather, Augustus's cold expectations. And in those moments, the garden didn't satisfy him, the power didn't comfort him, the villa felt like a tomb carved into a cliff, and he would sometimes stand at its edge, barefoot and shaking, looking down at the sea as if weighing whether to return to it the way he had once dreamed as a younger man, when the world still held warmth and wine still brought joy instead of numbness. But every time he turned back, not out of courage, but because he refused to let Rome have the last word. And so the emperor lived on, trapped in his own myth, growing older, colder, stranger, but not yet finished, because somewhere beneath the madness and pleasure and cruelty still burned a tiny ember of purpose, and whatever it was, it hadn't died yet. It was just waiting for the right moment to rise again. By the time Tiberius left Rome behind, the people barely saw him anymore. Not in the streets, not in the courts, not in the temples where emperors were supposed to offer sacrifice and show their faces to the gods. Instead, he disappeared into the sea, choosing exile not from punishment, but from power itself, vanishing into a place that would become darker than the capital he abandoned. Capri, the island of silence, where the wind howled against the cliffs and the waves never stopped crashing, where secrets could live and die without echo, and where the emperor finally let go of pretending. No more Senate debates, no more military parades, no more statues of virtue or coins with noble inscriptions. Capri became his empire, and the palace he built there, his sanctuary of indulgence. Here he did not need to rule with words or policies. He ruled with eyes, with gestures, with hungers that never ceased. The locals spoke of long marble halls that curved like the coils of a snake, windows without shutters, ceilings painted with stars, and floors always warm to the touch no matter the season, as if the whole place breathed beneath your feet. Tiberius surrounded himself not with senators, but with astrologers, jesters, whispering courtiers, and shadows that moved through the palace with bare feet and downcast eyes, trained not to speak unless spoken to, taught not to ask why. They said he walked those halls with a face that barely blinked, that he spoke only in riddles, that he kept jars of poisons and scrolls of forbidden knowledge in a private chamber at the top of the villa, guarded not by soldiers, but by silence itself. But more than anything, what made Capri infamous, what turned it from a place of beauty into a place of fear, was the Emperor's Garden, a name that sounded innocent, even peaceful, but in truth held terrors beyond what any garden should grow. It wasn't a place of roses or statues or olive trees, but a compound walled in marble where the rules of Rome no longer mattered, where Tiberius crafted his rituals of control, of domination, of shame, a world where the pain of others was a form of prayer and obedience was bought not with honor, but with humiliation. Here, it was said, he gathered those he favored and those he despised, sometimes for pleasure, sometimes for punishment, and no one could tell the difference. Those who were brought to the garden did not always return, and those who did came back quieter, slower, older than they had been just days before. Many were soldiers' wives sent to Capri on false pretenses, sometimes as guests of honor, sometimes as messengers, and yet once they entered the gates, they were stripped of title, of voice, of dignity, because Tiberius believed loyalty was best proven through the sacrifice of one's pride. He made husbands watch, or told them afterward what he had done, and those men, afraid to lose rank or life, simply nodded and bowed, swallowing the fury in their throats as the emperor smiled and sent their wives back, dressed in silence, marked by something that could never be washed away. He believed this was power, not the sword, not the law, but the ability to reshape a person's soul with nothing more than a glance and a command. And yet, Capri also became a prison, not just for his victims, but for Tiberius himself. Each day, he climbed higher into the cliffs, into villas carved into the rock, where sunlight barely reached, where he could watch the sea and believe he had escaped the stench of Rome, but the rot followed him. Servants said he screamed at night, that he woke drenched in sweat, that he whispered names no one recognized, and sometimes cried like a child. The villa walls heard confessions meant for no one, and the sea, crashing endlessly below, took his guilt and hurled it back up as foam on the rocks. Even the sky seemed to change. Clouds hung lower, stars looked like eyes, and birds flew in circles as if trapped in the air above the island. Capri, for all its beauty, had become cursed, not by gods, but by the man who ruled it. Yet Tiberius didn't stop. He kept the island locked down, sending messages to Rome only when necessary, ruling the empire from afar with brief, cold orders that left senators guessing and generals fearful. They never knew when his hand would strike or who would be summoned next to Capri, and the silence from the island was often more terrifying than any decree. Meanwhile, the emperor aged in solitude. His skin turned pale, his eyes darker, his voice softer. Some claimed he forgot how to speak entirely, that he communicated only with gestures, with glances, with the movements of a single finger that decided who lived, who died, and who served his whims that day. Rumors spread of tunnels beneath the villa, filled with mirrors and ropes, of rituals with no names, of feasts where laughter was banned and tears were served like wine. And through it all, Capri remained beautiful. White cliffs, blue water, green hills. But no one who served there ever saw that beauty again, because once you saw what the emperor did in the shadows, you could never see the sunlight the same way. And so Tiberius, far from Rome, ruled not with justice, but with fear, not over a city, but over an island carved in cruelty, a throne built on the broken backs of those who dared to serve him, love him, or simply live too close to him. And still he did not fall because no one had the courage to pull him down. Not yet. The Emperor Tiberius remained on Capri like a god exiled from heaven, not in disgrace but in defiance, surrounded not by marble glory but by whispers that wrapped themselves around the Roman Empire, like a fog no sun could burn away. And as his island palace grew more twisted, more remote from the reality of Rome, the Senate found itself caught in a strange paralysis, still calling him princeps, still stamping his decrees into law, still pretending their emperor was merely reclusive rather than something far darker. But they all knew that the man who once stood tall beside Augustus was gone, buried under layers of corruption, madness, and something even more dangerous: apathy. For Tiberius, from his cliffs and perfumed chambers, no longer saw the empire as a city of laws and legions, but as a stage where his whims became scripture, where punishment became pleasure, and where justice was no longer a principle, but a joke whispered between his private guards over spilled wine and screams from behind silk curtains. And as the empire's walls cracked under the weight of his absence, as rebellions stirred in distant provinces and governors turned against one another for favor that would never come, the man in the shadows remained untouched, unreachable, and unrelenting, watching the world he inherited slowly rot as if it were a play written solely for his amusement. Even those once closest to him, men like Sejanus, his feared and powerful praetorian commander, had long since been cast aside, their bones buried under politics and paranoia, for Tiberius trusted no one, not anymore. Not since Rome had shown him that love could be faked, loyalty could be bought, and adoration could be poisoned by ambition. Instead, he filled his halls with silence, interrupted only by the sound of foreign flutes, soft footsteps on polished stone, and the sighs of those brought before him. Not for counsel, not for statecraft, but for his private ceremonies of humiliation, rituals of control where young boys were stripped not only of clothing, but of identity, turned into living statues for his amusement, trained to remain still even under his most grotesque orders. And while some said he still spoke Latin, most believed he had long since abandoned human language, preferring gestures and symbols, looks and touches, as if his thoughts were too divine for mortal words. Meanwhile, Rome itself churned, uncertain and restless, watching the throne grow colder even as his authority remained absolute. And those who dared speak against him vanished, some into the sea, others into the prisons beneath the Palatine, their names scratched from records as if they had never lived. The people whispered about the sacrifices, the servants who never returned from Capri, the screams that some claim could be heard even from passing ships, and the merchants began to avoid the island. Not out of rebellion, but out of fear that the emperor might demand something too dear, too irreversible. Tiberius's madness, however, did not take the shape of raving or rage. It was quiet, cold, and calculated, like frost that kills from beneath the skin. And even in his old age, he was sharper than most, cunning enough to keep the Senate in line with letters filled with riddles and veiled threats, sharp enough to continue naming governors, raising taxes, and arranging marriages, all while barely rising from his bath, barely lifting his eyes from the darkened pools where he claimed to see the future reflected. And still, the horrors grew, the rituals deepened, the ceremonies lengthened. And it was said that in his final years, he began to blur the lines not just between ruler and god, but between life and death, keeping the dead unburied for days, seated at his dinner table, dressed in togas and painted faces, their mouths forced into smiles, their presence a lesson to all who disobeyed, that not even death could free you from Tiberius once you had entered his world. And perhaps that was the worst part. Not the cruelty, not the perversion, not even the empire's slow decay, but the sense that Tiberius no longer cared, that the screams of others did not excite him or disturb him, but bored him, as if he were playing the same game too many times, seeking new ways to feel anything at all. Capri was no longer his exile. It was his heaven and his hell, the only place where he could be free from the burden of pretending to be a man when he had become something else entirely. And as the people of Rome prayed for his death, begged the gods to take him, tried to forget him even as his name remained stamped on every coin, his ghost seemed to grow stronger, his hand more distant and more terrifying, because what Rome feared most wasn't that Tiberius would die. It was that he wouldn't, that he would remain forever in that villa, feeding on fear and memory, ruling an empire that had forgotten what it meant to feel safe. And so they waited, watching the skies, reading omens, clinging to the hope that this unnatural silence would soon be broken. But Capri gave no signs, and the emperor, old, pale, godlike, remained at the center of it all, the unmoving eye in a storm of suffering he had built for himself. And still no one dared rise against him, because as long as Tiberius lived, death had no rules and cruelty had no end. On the cliffs of Capri, Emperor Tiberius stood like a shadow carved into stone, his body older now, slower, wrapped in silk that dragged behind him like a second skin. And though his face had grown pale and his hands thin, the fire inside him had not gone out. It had only turned colder, sharper, and more dangerous. And by now, the island he ruled from had become something worse than a prison, worse than a palace. It had become a place where the soul went to rot, a floating throne where every scream vanished into wind and every crime was hidden behind golden curtains. And while Rome remained under his name, under his seal, under his cruel and quiet voice, carried through dusty letters. The real power had moved far from the city, resting fully on this rocky mountain above the sea, where slaves walked barefoot and silent, where soldiers kept their eyes low, where not even the birds sang loudly anymore. And yet every corner of the empire still bent to him, still feared the name of Tiberius, because the cruelty he unleashed from afar was more terrifying than war. He didn't just destroy his enemies, he erased them. He turned the truth into smoke, and those who tried to expose his darkness vanished without a trace. Their families silenced, their homes seized, their names removed from stone, as if they had never existed. And while the Senate met in Rome and pretended to govern, everyone knew their power was hollow, their voices useless, because no one could touch him. Not there, not on Capri, where he ruled like a ghost, an old god with young desires and old grudges. And by this point, he was no longer interested in ruling as a man. He believed he had become something greater, something outside of laws and flesh and shame. And so the island continued to change around him. Its halls no longer decorated with triumphs or maps or Roman flags, but instead with veils, cushions, marble pools, and painted ceilings, filled with naked figures dancing around a burning sun. And every room was filled with strange laughter. Not joyful, but hollow, forced, distant, and the people brought to him were no longer senators or scholars or warriors, but the beautiful, the broken, the frightened, and the innocent. Because Tiberius did not crave challenge. He craved control, and the games he played had grown darker over time, colder and more wicked. And the stories that drifted from the island like smoke across the sea were no longer just about power. They were about sickness, about an emperor who had lost his humanity but kept his hunger, about how he would have servants teach boys to swim in his private pools and do as he said, no matter how strange, how cruel, how unspeakable. And though the Roman people whispered these horrors behind closed doors, they still bowed to his statues, still kissed his coins, because fear ruled stronger than truth. And truth had been drowned long ago beneath the waves that hit the rocks of Capri and back in Rome. While taxes rose and corruption spread like fire, no one dared blame the emperor, at least not aloud, not in writing, not even in prayer, because to speak his name in anger was to invite ruin. And even the gods seemed to look away, letting Tiberius remain untouched. Even as blood was spilled for his pleasure, and boys were broken to feed his emptiness, and the old soldiers who had once fought beside him couldn't recognize the man he had become. But they said nothing, because they remembered what happened to those who spoke. They remembered how Sejanus, once the most powerful man in Rome, had been betrayed, executed, and his children too, thrown down the Gemonian stairs while Tiberius watched from afar, sipping wine, unmoved. And now the only voices left near him were those too afraid to tell the truth or too lost to understand what truth even was. And Capri had become not a retreat, not a fortress, but a kingdom of silence, where the only law was Tiberius's will, where the air smelled like incense and rot. And the emperor sat each night in his garden, watching the stars without blinking, speaking to no one, perhaps waiting for death, or perhaps believing he would never die. And the empire, stretched thin across continents, began to crumble at the edges, because when the man at the center of the storm no longer feels the wind, the world starts to spin out of control. And though the provinces still sent tribute, and generals still marched in his name, and cities still lit torches when his birthday came, everyone felt it, that something had gone wrong, deeply, horribly wrong, and that Tiberius no longer ruled as a man, but as a shadow. And when the shadow ruled, light itself became suspicious. And the truth, if it still lived anywhere in the empire, lived only in the broken hearts of those who had seen Capri up close and survived. And now they said the emperor did not sleep like other men, that he wandered his halls at night, barefoot and whispering, sometimes weeping, sometimes laughing, that he lit candles and placed them around the edge of his pool, watching their reflections tremble on the surface, that he touched the marble like it was flesh, and spoke to statues as if they might speak back. And when the sun rose, he would vanish behind curtains, and the island would grow quiet again, waiting for the next order, the next sacrifice, the next victim. And still no one dared rise against him, because everyone believed the same thing, that Tiberius might die one day. But until then, no one else was safe. The island of Capri had turned into a graveyard of secrets, a place soaked in shadows where truth had no name and mercy had no voice. And while Rome kept pretending its emperor was just away for a while, everyone knew he was no longer a ruler. They whispered that he had become something else entirely, something made of stone and wine and cruelty, something too twisted to be called a man but too powerful to ignore. And back in the capital, people walked carefully. Senators spoke in riddles, and generals clutched their ambitions like daggers, waiting, watching, wondering when the nightmare would finally end. And Tiberius, now old and gray and barely walking without help, still believed he was untouchable, that his legacy would stretch across centuries like the scars he left on others. But the world he built was starting to collapse piece by piece, because no empire can survive forever on fear alone, and the fear around him had begun to crack, slowly, like glass under pressure, and the cracks widened every time his letters arrived from Capri, demanding strange laws, removing old allies, promoting unknown men with soft voices and empty eyes. And in Rome, there was one man who waited more patiently than all the rest. Caligula, the adopted grandson, the charming actor who had learned from Tiberius how to smile and stab at the same time, who knew how to laugh in public and scheme in silence. And the emperor, in his twisted way, had begun to trust Caligula more than anyone else, even inviting him to Capri, even letting him see the dark corners no one else survived. And Caligula watched, listened, nodded, never flinched, never cried, even as he saw the pools, the children, the punishments, the rituals that had no names and no gods behind them. And Tiberius began to speak of him as an heir, as a mirror, as a reflection of the fire he once had, not realizing that Caligula was already planning something, already speaking to the right men in the shadows, already making sure that, when the moment came, the knives would be pointed the right way. And Tiberius, despite all his cruelty and wisdom, never saw it coming, because monsters rarely believe they can be hunted, especially when they wear crowns. And as his body weakened and his voice faded, he clung harder to the rituals, the baths, the boys, the silence, believing he was still in control, even as the soldiers guarding him whispered to one another in the dead of night, even as his servants glanced nervously at Caligula and kept their eyes down when the old man entered the room. And one morning, as the sky turned orange and the sea below Capri looked still and endless, Tiberius did not rise from his bed, and the doctors were called, and they spoke in vague terms, unsure if the emperor was dying or simply dreaming. And Caligula was summoned, told to prepare, and he came in silence, dressed in black, his hands folded like a priest, his face calm, and he sat beside the bed, looking at the man who had shaped him, broken him, taught him, tortured him, and without blinking, he waited, and when the breathing stopped, there was a moment, a single moment, where the world held its breath, and then a whisper, quiet, like wind through curtains. He is gone, and yet he wasn't, because suddenly Tiberius gasped, sat up, his eyes wild, his mouth open, alive, furious, defiant. And the room froze, unsure, terrified, until one of the guards, silent, steady, stepped forward, placed a pillow over the emperor's face, and pushed slowly, carefully, until the breathing stopped again. And this time, it did not return. And just like that, Tiberius, once general, once emperor, once god of his own island, was dead, smothered not by an army, not by an enemy, but by the quiet hand of a man who had simply had enough, and his body was wrapped in robes and hidden away, and his death was announced to the empire as peaceful, natural, dignified, though everyone knew it was a lie and no one cared, because what mattered was not how he died, but that he died, that the monster was gone, that the shadow had finally lifted, and Caligula stepped forward, smiling, weeping, pretending to mourn while already gathering power, already planning his own twisted reign. And as Rome celebrated, as the priests chanted, as the Senate bowed, they tried not to remember what Tiberius had done, what he had taken, what he had become, and they tore down some statues, burned some scrolls, changed the laws. But they couldn't erase what lingered in the palace walls, in the nightmares of slaves, in the bones of Capri where screams once echoed. And though Tiberius was gone, the fear he left behind did not fade. It simply changed names, changed shapes, and waited to return. Tiberius was gone, but the shadow he cast didn't die with him. And even though his body was cold and buried with honor in Rome's official records, the people who had seen what he truly was knew better. because emperors may die, but the fear they spread doesn't get buried. It lingers in walls, in water, in whispers, and in the years that followed, those who had lived through the silence of Capri, the servants, the guards, the boys who grew old with haunted eyes, they all knew that something had changed forever, that Rome had been poisoned in a way no law could fix, because when Tiberius ruled, cruelty wasn't an accident. It was routine, and the horror wasn't in what he did only, but in how normal it became, how even the sickest parts of him were tolerated, protected, hidden under the gold of a crown, and the island where he reigned in secret, where he laughed while others bled, where he built a life of pleasure and pain, became known not just as a place of retreat, but as a curse. And fishermen passing by said they heard screams on quiet nights, saw pale figures on the cliffs, felt sick without cause, and they believed that Tiberius hadn't left. Not really, not entirely, because the kind of darkness he created wasn't something that faded with time. It was the kind that seeps into the cracks of empire, into the hearts of men who think power gives them permission to do anything. And back in Rome, statues of him remained, cleaned and polished, his name still listed among the emperors. But in private, the story survived, not in official scrolls, but in kitchen gossip, in frightened prayers, in old songs that didn't name him, but described him too clearly to be anyone else. And people would say Capri changed him. But the truth was, Capri revealed him, pulled off the mask, showed what was underneath, and what was underneath was not a man of justice or strength. It was a predator with an army, a god in his own mind, a creature who believed others existed only for his desire. And even as later emperors rose, even as the empire marched on, there was always the fear that another Tiberius could appear, that behind the charm and titles, another soul just like his waited for a crown to give him permission. And what terrified Rome most wasn't that he had ruled, but that so many had allowed it, that so many had stayed quiet, bowed their heads, obeyed, and even helped, because when power becomes cruelty and no one stops it, it grows roots, deep ones. And Tiberius had planted a garden of silence and pain, and its flowers still bloomed long after his death, not in temples or markets, but in how people looked at emperors differently, in how trust cracked between the people and the throne, in how even the whisper of Capri could freeze a room. And those who remembered him spoke of eyes that never blinked, of orders given without raising his voice, of a man who could smile while someone wept at his feet. And they said that when he died, no gods wept, no birds sang, and the sky stayed quiet. Not out of respect, but out of disgust. And some claimed that Tiberius still walked the halls of his old villa, barefoot, searching for what he lost, still calling for the boys who once obeyed, still demanding worship from gods who had long abandoned him. And in the ruins of Capri, tourists take photos, historians take notes, but none of them understand what really happened there, what was done and what was broken, because history can't always hold the full weight of horror. It can only hint at it, hide it between lines. And the truth about Tiberius is this: he ruled not just an empire, but a nightmare disguised as glory. And though his name might not be carved in stone as a monster, it lives like one in memory, a shadow that proves power without mercy becomes rot. And now that you've seen his story, the question isn't just what he did, but what we allow, what we overlook, what we excuse in the name of greatness. So remember this not as entertainment, not as ancient trivia, but as a warning, because history doesn't whisper these things unless it's afraid they're about to return. If this story disturbed you, moved you, or opened your eyes to a side of history they don't teach in school, don't look away. Like the video, subscribe for more true stories of power, fear, and the forgotten. And share this with someone who believes emperors were only men in marble, not monsters in silk, because the past doesn't just repeat itself, it waits.